Hi, this is Professor Earth. I teach classes on climate change and I study climate change in Alaska. Here we've got lots of climate change problems. The Arctic sea ice is receding, it's growing less every year. So we have coastal erosion, and that's not helped by sea level rise. We've got the permafrost thawing because the climate is warming very significantly. And we have tree kill, and we have massive forest fires because of global warming. And don't even get me started on what this is doing to the wildlife like polar bears. The climate change is affecting the ecosystems, and that's affecting wildlife throughout Alaska. I sometimes look at YouTube to look at climate change videos to see what's out there in the popular media, and I am amazed to see that many of the most popular climate change videos on YouTube are by Dr. Steven Koonin. And Dr. Steven Koonin basically has one idea, that climate science is not settled. And he repeats this idea over and over again, and he goes beyond this. He doesn't really know anything about the science or about what's happening in the world, but he has one point that he's trying to make, and by saying climate science is not really settled, then he goes on to attack the entire subject. The reason that Dr. Koonin thinks that climate science is not settled is because he's a computer modeler. He understands that in computer modeling, there are inherent issues and problems. They're not perfect representations of the real world. But everybody knows that, including the climate modelers. That's why they present multiple examples, different model runs and different computer models entirely, to try to get around this issue, and they present error bars around their predictions. Everybody knows climate models have problems. The reality is that Dr. Koonin is a one-trick pony. He knows something about climate modeling, but really nothing about paleoclimatology or ongoing climate change. And so he's pretty good when he says, a climate model has problems. But he runs into trouble the second he tries to say anything else about climate change. And much of what he says is total nonsense. The net effect of this is to spread fear, uncertainty, and doubt about the reliability of climate change predictions. But there are just so many problems with what Dr. Koonin is saying. Let's even go back to climate models, which is his main area of expertise. He says that everyone knows what a weather model is, and we can see that they break down after 10 days. They're not accurate, so this should cast doubt on the reliability of climate models. But that's comparing apples and oranges. The fact of it is a climate model is run under set conditions through an entire year or series of years, and the results averaged to see what the climate is. At no time do you predict a single day. And you can take the same climate model and run it today and reproduce today's climate. That proves it's valid. Then you change the conditions to predict future climate. And Dr. Koonin doesn't seem to know that. Another nonsensical statement that Dr. Koonin makes is that global warming has been going on for 400 years. That implies it's not due to human carbon release since the 19th century. But Koonin is totally wrong. There's something called the Little Ice Age, a cooling of the planet that lasted from the 14th through the 19th century. Earth has not been warming for 400 years. He's just making that up and spreading fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Another inaccurate statement by Dr. Koonin is that the amount of climate forcing caused by CO2 in the atmosphere is relatively small, perhaps 1%. So this isn't enough to cause major climate change. It should only cause about a 1% change in climate. Well, that totally misunderstands the way the greenhouse effect works. The greenhouse effect traps heat in the earth, and that heat builds up through time. It's not a one-time effect from some increase in the solar constant or the retention of solar heating on the earth. It builds up through time. He doesn't seem to know that, or he's misrepresenting the facts again. And another crazy thing that Dr. Koonin says is that when he looks at all climate models, that about 40% of them are predicting warming more than we're actually seeing. So that must mean that there's some real problem. They're not reliable. What he doesn't seem to realize is the planet is actually warming quicker than the average of most climate models. In fact, the ICCP seems to think we're warming about 1.2 degrees C to the current time, but in fact, the actual amount of warming is over 1.5 C already. So in fact, we're about 20 years ahead of the predictions from the ICCP, And this is a problem. Perhaps those climate models that predict more warming are more accurate. And that's something we really need to take into account. Another outrageously inaccurate claim by Dr. Koonin is it doesn't really matter if it warms up because more people die from cold climates than warm climates, so warming's not that big a problem. He clearly doesn't know that the series of heat waves that have affected the world have killed tens of thousands of people in recent years. In 2022, as many as 60,000 people are thought to die in Europe, and they certainly have good medical records there. There's a huge problem, global warming and heat waves, and the deaths they're causing. Well, I could go on and on with things that Dr. Koonin has said, but I'd like to focus on a few of the more outrageous things that I see in his presentations. One of them is that he says that fears of future catastrophes from climate change depend on feeding extreme scenarios into climate models. That's totally untrue. What Dr. Koonin is calling an extreme scenario is reality. We currently have over 420 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere, and we started at 280. So we're up about 50% in the amount of CO2, a powerful greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. Of course, that's going to warm things. And the last time we had this much CO2 in the atmosphere was about 14 or 15 million years ago, when sea level was about 40 meters higher. That's not an extreme scenario. That's how much CO2 is in the atmosphere right this minute. Finally, the last claim of Steven Koonin, and I quote directly, is advocacy for overly rapid decarbonization is immoral, unquote. Well, suddenly we've left the world of science and we've moved into morality. Suddenly, Steven Koonin is some kind of climate saint who can say what's moral and what's immoral in terms of action. It's no longer about the data, it's about morality. Here I think the mask has come off. And Steven Koonin has revealed himself as a simple climate denier. Now, he's not yelling hoax, hoax, hoax like Donald Trump. But throughout all of his discussions, even though he admits there's some small degree of global warming, every other aspect of the problem he ignores or he misrepresents or he cites some data that doesn't exist. It completely obfuscates the problem. Clearly something curious is going on here. Steven Koonin is presenting himself as a scientist who's looking at this objectively, and yet suddenly he's using the language of morality to try to make a case for fossil fuels. Well, clearly that's his main point, that he thinks we should continue to use fossil fuels. And of course, he was once chief scientist for British Petroleum. But whether or not we use fossil fuels, or we try to shift to a more low-carbon economy to reduce the CO2 we put in the atmosphere, should be purely a scientific question. And personally, I think the data is very clear that global warming is a real problem. We need to do something about it, and all we can do is try to reduce the carbon intensity of our economies.